The dust of Cheyenne in 1876 settled on Pastor Elias Thorne's polished boots, a stark contrast to the crisp, clean lines of his East Coast suit. He stood tall, his Bible clutched in one hand, a picture of devout reverence. He had just finished a sermon, his voice still echoing with promises of salvation and community spirit, when a shadow fell across the street. A farmer, weathered and grim-faced, pushed through the small crowd. His eyes, usually kind, now burned with a cold fire. He stopped directly in front of Pastor Thorne, close enough for the pastor to smell the dry earth clinging to his clothes. The farmer didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice much above a murmur, but every word cut through the air like a razor. "You preached of truth, Pastor. You spoke of God's light. But you, Elias Thorne, you stole my land. You tricked me out of everything I had." A stunned silence fell over the street. The few townsfolk who had lingered after the sermon froze, their eyes darting between the farmer and the pastor. This wasn't just an accusation, it was a public shaming, an assault on everything Pastor Thorne represented in this burgeoning frontier town. His reputation, his very standing, was being shredded before everyone. Pastor Thorne's face, which moments before had held a beatific smile, didn't crumple in denial. There was no outrage, no desperate plea for understanding. Instead, a strange calm washed over him. His eyes, usually so earnest, now held a flicker of something unreadable, almost a resignation. He didn't drop his Bible. He didn't even flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself. His knees hit the hard, unforgiving dirt of the Cheyenne street with a soft thud. He didn't look up at the farmer or at the gaping faces of the townsfolk. He simply bowed his head, his dark hair falling forward, obscuring his face. It wasn't a prayer. No, it wasn't an act of repentance in the traditional sense. It was a surrender, an admission laid bare for all to see. The dust, disturbed by his fall, swirled around his expensive suit, marking him. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and dawning realizations. The harvest of deceit had begun. The pastor remained on his knees, head bowed low, a motionless figure in the center of the street. The farmer stood over him, his lean frame rigid, his jaw set. The accusation hung in the air, a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. What exactly had Pastor Thorne done? What kind of trickery had he used to steal a man's land in a town where land meant everything? The small crowd shifted uneasily, a collective gasp forming in their throats. They had come for spiritual guidance, for comfort, and instead, they had witnessed a betrayal that shook the very foundations of their fledgling community. The sun beat down, harsh and unforgiving, on the bowed head of the man who had promised them salvation. The question remained, what would become of him in this unforgiving frontier town, where justice was often swift and brutal? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Cheyenne in 1876 was a place of raw energy and wild dreams, a town carved out of the vast, untamed plains. It wasn't old like the cities back east. It was new, smelling of pine, sawdust, and the distant tang of buffalo. The Union Pacific Railroad had birthed it, a roaring iron snake bringing people, goods, and a certain kind of chaos. There were wooden buildings, mostly, springing up fast, housing saloons, general stores, a few boarding houses, and of course the beginnings of a church. Dust was everywhere, kicked up by horses, wagons, and the constant movement of folks trying to make their mark. The population was a mix, a real melting pot of ambition. You had the railroad men, tough and practical, the prospectors with gold fever in their eyes, farmers and ranchers staking their claims on the fertile land around the creek, and merchants looking to get rich off all of them. Native American tribes like the Cheyenne and Arapaho were still a strong presence, their history deeply etched into the landscape, even as their way of life was being pushed aside. Social norms were a strange blend here. There was a strong sense of community and helping hands when disaster struck, but also a fierce independence and a quickness to settle disputes with a fist or a gun. Reputation was everything, especially for those who claimed to be leaders. A man's word, or his faith, was supposed to be his bond. Pastor Elias Thorne had arrived in this whirlwind of a town just a few years prior, a stark contrast to the world he'd left behind. He grew up in a quiet, brick-lined town in Massachusetts, where the church spires reached higher than any other building, and Sunday sermons were the highlight of the week. His family was respected, pious, and well-off. Elias was the youngest of 3 sons. always a bit more sensitive, more drawn to books and contemplation than his brothers, who took to the family's mercantile business. He'd gone to a good seminary, filled with youthful idealism, dreaming of spreading God's word to places that truly needed it. He saw the West as a blank canvas, a place where he could build something new, a testament to his faith. He wanted respect, yes, but he also genuinely believed he could make a difference, bring order and morality to what he saw as a wild, lawless land. Yet, beneath that polished exterior, there were cracks, a deep-seated need for approval, a fear of failure that sometimes made him cut corners, and a subtle, almost unconscious tendency to put his own comfort and status above rigid principles. His faith was genuine in its own way, but it was a faith that could bend and twist to fit his earthly desires. The farmer, a man named Thomas Miller, had been one of the first to greet Pastor Thorne when he arrived. Thomas was a salt-of-the-earth type, a man who worked hard, spoke plainly, and trusted easily. He'd come to Cheyenne with little more than a strong back and a dream of owning his own piece of land, a dream he'd made real through years of sweat and grit. He'd found a good plot outside town, fertile and with access to water, and had built a modest home for his family. When Pastor Thorne started holding services in a makeshift tent, Thomas was there every Sunday, bringing his wife and children. He saw the pastor as a beacon, a man of God who would bring civilization and a moral compass to their rough-and-tumble community. Thomas had even contributed some of his own meager earnings to help build the first proper church building. Their connection deepened through shared community projects. The pastor often visited Thomas's farm, admiring his crops, offering words of encouragement. Thomas, in turn, respected the pastor's education and his calm demeanor. He looked up to Elias, saw him as a leader, a man who could guide them all. They talked about the future of Cheyenne, about building a strong, righteous community. Thomas trusted Elias with his hopes, his fears, even some of his financial dealings, seeking advice from a man he believed was both wise and incorruptible. This initial trust, this seemingly innocent connection, was the seed from which their deep conflict would inevitably grow. In a frontier town where trust was precious and easily broken, where a handshake often meant more than a written contract, the stage was set for a betrayal that would shake Thomas Miller to his core. The cracks in their relationship started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like tiny fissures appearing in dry earth. Thomas, being a straightforward man, didn't notice them at first, or perhaps he chose to ignore them, giving Elias the benefit of the doubt. The pastor's words always sounded so right, so comforting, even when his actions started to feel a little off. One of the first noticeable shifts came during a community meeting about a new irrigation ditch. Thomas had proposed a route that would benefit several smaller farms, including his own, and was more cost-effective. Pastor Thorne, however, had subtly pushed for a different route, one that seemed to favor a few larger landholders who were new to town and had recently made generous donations to the church. Elias framed it as a matter of efficiency, of supporting those who were contributing most significantly to Cheyenne's growth. Thomas felt a sting of dismissiveness when the pastor, with a gentle smile, suggested that Thomas's plan, while well-intentioned, might be too focused on individual concerns rather than the greater communal good. It wasn't an outright rejection, but it undermined Thomas's credibility in front of his neighbors. The ditch eventually followed the pastor's preferred route, leaving Thomas and others with less reliable water access. Then, there were the broken promises wrapped in spiritual advice. Thomas had once confided in Elias about a difficult harvest, sharing his worries about making ends meet. The pastor had offered to facilitate a loan from a wealthy newcomer, assuring Thomas it would be a low-interest arrangement, a gesture of Christian charity. Thomas, grateful, had accepted. But the terms of the loan, when they finally materialized, were far less favorable than promised. When Thomas approached Elias about it, the pastor simply shrugged, saying, "My dear Thomas, sometimes God tests our faith through financial struggles. Perhaps this is an opportunity for you to learn patience and trust in His plan." It felt like a betrayal, a manipulation of his trust, masked by religious platitudes. Thomas felt foolish for having confided so much in him. Elias also had a way of subtly humiliating Thomas. During church gatherings, if Thomas offered an opinion on a local issue, Elias would often interject, not to contradict directly, but to clarify Thomas's point, reshaping it into something more aligned with his own views. usually making Thomas's original thought seem less informed or simplistic. It was never a direct insult, but a constant chipping away at Thomas's confidence, a way for Elias to assert his intellectual and moral authority. Thomas started to speak less in public, feeling that his words would only be twisted or diminished. He saw the glances from other townsfolk, the way some would nod along with Elias's corrections, and a slow burn of resentment began to simmer within him. The manipulation extended to community opinions. Elias had a knack for swaying conversations, for presenting situations in a way that always benefited him or his favored associates. He'd frame land disputes as matters of divine will or business dealings as opportunities for spiritual growth, always with an eye on his own advantage. For instance, when a piece of land adjacent to Thomas's farm came up for sale, Thomas expressed interest. Elias, hearing this, subtly spread rumors that the land was infertile, prone to flooding, and a poor investment. Yet, a few months later, that very same land was bought by one of Elias's close church associates, who then resold it at a significant profit. Thomas realized he had been played, his opportunity stolen by the pastor's veiled words. These moments of injustice piled up, creating a heavy burden on Thomas. He saw how Elias's piety was a shield, deflecting any criticism, allowing him to act with impunity. In a frontier town where a man's word and his reputation were his most valuable assets, Elias Thorne was chipping away at both, not just for Thomas, but for anyone who stood in his way, all under the guise of spiritual leadership. The cultural context of self-reliance and directness in Cheyenne made these subtle betrayals even more galling. Thomas didn't want charity. He wanted fairness, honesty, and respect. He had given his trust freely, and Elias had twisted it for his own gain. The scene of the pastor kneeling in the dust was not a sudden explosion, but the inevitable eruption of years of festering resentment and moral compromise. The emotional atmosphere between Thomas and Elias grew increasingly strained. It was almost like a physical weight in the air whenever they were in the same room. Thomas tried to avoid Elias, but in a town the size of Cheyenne, it was impossible. Every Sunday, he had to sit in church and listen to Elias preach about honesty and brotherhood, feeling the hypocrisy like a bitter taste in his mouth. He watched Elias's sermons, studying the pastor's face, looking for any crack in the facade, any sign that the man knew the damage he was doing. But Elias always seemed calm, confident, even radiant. It made Thomas's blood boil. Minor disagreements, which had once been brushed aside, now felt sharp and personal. If Thomas commented on the weather, Elias would find a way to connect it to a biblical passage, subtly implying Thomas lacked spiritual depth. Simple conversations about crop yields would turn into veiled lectures about God's providence, always with Elias positioning himself as the ultimate interpreter of divine will. Thomas started to feel like every interaction was a trap, a chance for Elias to assert his dominance and belittle him. He'd clench his jaw, forcing himself to stay silent, knowing that any challenge would only be met with a condescending smile and another carefully crafted dismissal. Elias's influence in Cheyenne was growing, not just spiritually, but financially. He seemed to be involved in every major land deal, every new business venture. Town meetings, once open forums, became platforms for Elias to push his own agenda, disguised as community improvement. He'd talk about the need for new development, for progress, always hinting at opportunities that only his closest associates seemed to benefit from. Thomas saw how Elias was acquiring more and more property, building a small empire, and pushing out anyone who wasn't part of his inner circle. Thomas felt the pressure, the fear of being marginalized, of his own small farm becoming irrelevant in Elias's grand schemes. He tried to voice concerns during a town meeting about a proposed new road that would cut through several small farms, including his own, but Elias simply smiled, called his concerns parochial, and moved the discussion along, effectively silencing him. The pastor's true character began to emerge more clearly. The subtle manipulations became more overt, the condescension more pronounced. Elias became arrogant, dismissing criticism with a wave of his hand or a patronizing pat on the shoulder. His sermons, once inspiring to many, now felt hollow to Thomas, full of contradictions. Elias would preach about humility and charity, then openly boast about his latest acquisition, or criticize those who weren't as industrious as he was, often referring to struggling farmers. Whispers started among some of the townsfolk, a growing discomfort with the pastor's increasing wealth and decreasing empathy. People noticed that Elias rarely helped with manual labor, yet always took credit for community projects. He seemed to delegate all the hard work, while he handled the spiritual guidance, which often meant just talking. Thomas felt the weight of judgment from his neighbors and even his own family. His wife, Martha, initially urged him to be patient, to trust in God's plan. But as Elias's actions became more blatant, Martha too began to see the truth. Yet many still revered Elias. They saw him as the pillar of the community, the man who brought order and faith to a wild frontier town. When Thomas tried to explain his grievances, some neighbors would nod politely, but others would look at him with suspicion as if he were questioning a saint. This period was one of the greatest emotional suffocation for Thomas. He felt isolated, his truth unheard. While Elias continued to thrive, his power seemingly unchallenged, the resentment festered, turning into a deep-seated anger, a quiet determination. He knew something had to give. He just didn't know what or when. The turning point arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, persistent rustle. Thomas had always been meticulous with his farm records, every bushel of wheat, every head of cattle, every penny spent or earned. It was a habit from his father, a way to keep things clear in a world that often wasn't. One evening, while sorting through old land deeds and tax receipts, he stumbled upon a faded, almost illegible document tucked away in a forgotten box. It was a copy of the original land survey for his farm, dated years before Elias had even arrived in Cheyenne. Comparing it to a more recent survey Elias had pushed through the town council, Thomas noticed a subtle but significant discrepancy. A small, seemingly unimportant strip of land, bordering his property and vital for accessing a natural spring, was missing from the new document. It was a strip that Elias had recently acquired, claiming it was unproductive, unused land. Thomas felt a cold dread spread through him. He remembered Elias's casual remarks about optimizing land use, about modernizing property lines for the good of the community. What seemed like an innocent oversight now looked like a calculated theft. This wasn't just about a piece of land, it was about the spring, the only reliable water source during dry spells that sustained his crops and livestock. Losing it would cripple his farm. This revelation, quiet as it was, shattered the existing dynamic between them. It wasn't just Elias's arrogance or his veiled insults anymore. This was a direct threat to Thomas's livelihood, his family's future. The vague suspicions he'd harbored, the whispers he'd ignored, all clicked into place. Elias wasn't just a hypocrite, he was a thief, using his position to systematically strip others of their resources. Driven to the brink, Thomas knew he couldn't stay silent. He had to expose Elias not just for himself, but for the other farmers, for the community that Elias was slowly, subtly taking advantage of. The risks were huge. Elias was powerful, well-connected, and held significant sway over the town. People might not believe Thomas, might even turn against him. He could lose everything, his farm, his reputation, maybe even his family's safety. But the thought of letting Elias continue, of seeing his own farm wither because of a lie, was unbearable. He made a definitive choice. He would fight. His decision hardened when he learned of another incident. A widow, Mrs. Gable, whose small parcel of land was also near the spring, had been pressured by Elias to sell her property for a pittance, citing an obscure legal clause. She was distraught, facing destitution. Elias, ever the benevolent pastor, had offered to buy it himself, promising to take care of her. It was a familiar pattern, a predatory kindness. This was the final straw. Thomas realized it wasn't just about him. Elias's actions were a sickness spreading through Cheyenne. An unexpected opportunity arose a few days later. The annual town meeting was scheduled, a gathering where all important community matters were discussed and voted upon. Elias, of course, would be present, likely chairing the meeting, presenting his latest development plans. It was the perfect and perhaps only public forum where Thomas could present his case. He knew he had to be prepared, to have irrefutable proof. He spent days poring over land records, talking to other farmers who had similar boundary disputes, gathering every scrap of evidence he could find. He even managed to get a copy of Mrs. Gable's original deed, which clearly showed her full claim, contradicting Elias's legal threats. The weight of this task was immense, but it filled him with a strange resolve. This was more than just a personal grievance. It was a stand for truth in a town that was slowly being corrupted. He would not let Elias continue to hide behind his collar. The truth, he believed, would eventually find its way out, and he was determined to be the one to bring it to light no matter the cost. The immediate aftermath of Thomas's decision to expose Elias was a whirlwind of emotions. Elias, when confronted at the town meeting, first reacted with a practiced, pious shock. His eyes, usually so calm, flashed with something akin to panic, quickly masked by an expression of wounded innocence. He denied everything, of course, calling Thomas's accusations baseless slander, an attack orchestrated by those jealous of his success and commitment to the community. He tried to turn the tables, painting Thomas as a disgruntled, envious man trying to undermine the church and progress. For a moment, it seemed Elias might succeed. His reputation, built over years of careful manipulation, held strong with many of the townsfolk. There were murmurs of disbelief, whispers of how Thomas could dare speak ill of a man of God. But Thomas was ready. He presented his evidence methodically, the land deeds, the survey maps comparing old boundaries to new ones, the testimony from other farmers who had faced similar oversights. He even brought Mrs. Gable, frail but resolute, to recount how Elias had tried to swindle her. The community of Cheyenne reacted in waves. Initially, many of the townsfolk, especially those who benefited from Elias's influence or were simply afraid to challenge him, stood by the pastor. They muttered about respect for the cloth, about keeping the peace. They looked at Thomas with suspicion, some even with outright hostility. These were the people who had invested in Elias's vision, perhaps literally buying into his land schemes or benefiting from his connections. They saw Thomas as a disruptive force, threatening the stability they believed Elias provided. However, as Thomas laid out the facts, the tide slowly began to turn. The sheer weight of the evidence, coupled with Mrs. Gable's tearful account, started to chip away at Elias's carefully constructed facade. Some of the older residents who had known Cheyenne before Elias arrived remembered a simpler, more honest time. They had harbored their own quiet suspicions about the pastor's rapid accumulation of wealth and influence. Now these suspicions found a voice. They began to question Elias, their faces etched with a mixture of betrayal and dawning comprehension. Others, who had perhaps been victims of Elias's less overt manipulations, a poor trade deal, a promise unkept, a subtle slight, felt a surge of vindication. They started to speak up, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, corroborating Thomas's claims with their own experiences. A few farmers who had lost small plots of land to Elias's modernization efforts now saw their losses in a new, clearer light. They became allies to Thomas, offering support and sharing their own stories, adding more weight to the accusations. The frontier setting influenced these reactions profoundly. Cheyenne was a place where individual reputation was paramount, but so was self-reliance and a fierce sense of justice. People might tolerate a charlatan for a while, especially one who presented himself as a spiritual leader, but outright theft and hypocrisy, especially when it affected their livelihoods, was a different matter entirely. The idea of frontier justice, rough and direct, began to stir. Elias's standing as a spiritual leader and community figure was not just damaged, it was utterly shattered. The respect he commanded, which was always tinged with fear, evaporated, replaced by open scorn and anger. Elias, seeing his carefully built world crumble around him, experienced deep psychological turmoil. The initial shock gave way to a desperate, almost frantic attempt to regain control. He tried to shout down Thomas, to discredit Mrs. Gable, to dismiss all the evidence as a conspiracy, but his words lacked their usual conviction. The mask had slipped, revealing the fear beneath. His eyes darted around, no longer meeting anyone's gaze. The isolation was immediate and palpable. People began to turn their backs, literally, as he spoke, their faces grim. The fear of exposure had become a harsh public reality, leading him into a spiral of despair and public shaming. He was no longer the respected pastor. He was just Elias, a man caught in his own web of deceit. The once respected pastor, Elias, found himself facing a Cheyenne that no longer bowed to his influence. The immediate aftermath of the public confrontation was chaos, but as the dust settled, a new, stark reality emerged. The town's citizens, having witnessed his unraveling, demanded accountability. Frontier justice, while not always formal, was swift and often unforgiving. There was no court of law in Cheyenne equipped for such a complex case, but the court of public opinion was in full session. A town meeting was called not by Elias, but by a collective of the most respected citizens, including Thomas and Mrs. Gable's family. Elias, stripped of his clerical garb and his customary air of authority, was forced to stand before the very people he had manipulated. He tried to speak, to offer excuses, to promise restitution, but his voice was weak, his words hollow. The power he once wielded had vanished, replaced by a profound shame that seemed to shrink him physically. The town, after much deliberation, decided on a punishment fitting the crime in their eyes. Elias was to be stripped of all his ill-gotten gains, the land he had acquired through dubious means, the investments he had secured by exploiting trust. All were to be redistributed to their rightful owners or to the community chest. This process was messy and prolonged, requiring careful investigation and documentation by a small committee formed for the purpose. Thomas, with his sharp mind and unwavering sense of right, played a crucial role in untangling Elias's financial web. Beyond the financial restitution, there was the matter of his presence in Cheyenne. The community, in a near unanimous decision, declared that Elias was no longer welcome. He was given a short period to gather his few legitimate belongings, and then he was to leave, never to return. The once proud pastor, who had arrived with such grand ambitions, departed Cheyenne under the cover of night, a solitary figure on a dusty road, his reputation shattered, his influence evaporated. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back and the heavy burden of his own deceit. There were no goodbyes, no well wishes, only the silent, resolute judgment of a community he had betrayed. His ultimate fate remained a mystery to the people of Cheyenne. Some whispered of him trying to start anew in another distant town, only to be recognized and driven out. Others imagined him wandering, a ghost of his former self, forever haunted by his past. Whatever became of Elias, it was clear that his life as a respected man of God, or even as a respected man, was over. He had reaped what he sowed, and the harvest was bitter. For Thomas, the resolution brought a quiet sense of peace. He had not sought revenge, but justice. His farm, once threatened, was secure. More importantly, his integrity, which had been questioned, was now affirmed. He had stood up for what was right, not just for himself, but for the entire community. He continued his work, a steady, honest presence, rebuilding trust and fostering a genuine sense of community spirit. The story of Elias served as a powerful, enduring lesson for Cheyenne. It was a stark reminder that even in a raw, untamed frontier, truth and integrity held immense value. Hypocrisy, especially from those who claimed moral authority, would eventually be exposed. The incident solidified the town's understanding of true leadership, not as a position of power or influence, but as a commitment to honesty, empathy, and service. The long-term impact of Elias's actions was a strengthened community, one that learned to look beyond appearances and to value character above all else. The dust of Cheyenne had settled, leaving behind a clearer understanding of justice, accountability, and the enduring power of truth.